We stayed there 5 or 6 years, planted a church, planted a daughter church out of that. We moved down the road to Erie, Pennsylvania for a few years and planted a church there, and then 2 churches out of that church. And then I was asked to become a seminary professor and teach church planting. I'd done a couple of masters and a doctoral degree along the way, and I was asked to teach church planting. And so it was interesting because I said, all right, I don't know, I know what I've done, but I need to know more. I need to know about movements, what's gone before me. And so I actually got permission to spend a couple of months in just preparation before I taught my first class, and I took a trip. And I actually took a trip to Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. And it was actually pretty funny. To be perfectly honest, it was funny because I came in on Wednesday night, and I remember 2 things. Number 1, I had a little baby, and you wouldn't let the baby in the auditorium. I'm still bitter about that. And number 2, that's probably still a rule. And number 2, there were 2 people sitting on a stage with guitars, just like you two, except I think it was your dad. And back then, it was about 13, 14, 15 years ago. And I interviewed some of the staff and learned about what you were doing and along the way. And so for me to be able to share with you tonight, I don't usually, like I said, don't usually do church planting events, but I'm happy to do this because I'm just thrilled to be here and to learn. I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'll stop talking about you and maybe encourage you just in the church planting area. I lead a seminar. I actually don't do it publicly, and that sounds weird. Why do you do it publicly? Because I actually kind of map the evangelical movement since the 60s. And I call it Contours of the Modern Evangelical Movement. And I do it for kind of key leaders. I've done it sometimes for global missionaries who have been maybe out of the country for a while, explain what's going on. But I've also done it at some gatherings of key leaders, kind of talk about where are we, what have we learned, what have we become. If you looked at my chart, I actually can show you, maybe we'll go to breakfast or something in the morning. The chart starts in the lower left-hand corner with 2 things. It starts with a book by a guy named Donald Miller, not the cool Donald Miller who wrote Blue Like Jazz, but the much less cool Donald Miller at USC, who wrote the book Reinventing American Protestantism. And he talked a lot about you. And so your Calvary Chapel is actually on the lower left-hand corner as one of the most significant movements. And out of there, and it's Calvary Chapel and others as well, but Calvary Chapel, and out of there come lines that begin to influence movements all over the world. And so, and particularly the contours of the modern evangelical movement here. So you probably know that. I don't. You probably get tired of people telling you that. But to me, it's encouraging to be able to share here a little bit with you along the way. And so that's what I want to do is I want to encourage you. The Bible tells us in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10. I should warn you that I see people reaching for your Bible. I love that. I love that you guys actually do that. But I'm actually not going to do an exposition tonight. That's normally how I preach and teach, but that's not. Okay, I'm specifically asked to talk about some issues, and I'm going to do more of a seminar. But I want, if you don't mind, I want to lay some scriptural foundation for what I want to talk about today. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10 says this. It says that God has chosen the church to make known His manifold wisdom. God's the instrument, the tool for God's agenda in the world is the church. And the church has kind of fallen on hard times to a lot of people. There's bad statistics about the church. I sometimes share some of those. I think tomorrow in USA Today, there'll be an article I wrote on what does it look like? What's the future of the church look like? What's the future of Christianity in North America look like? Because we're in sort of a season when people don't like the church, and sometimes even evangelical Christians don't like the church. There's a bit of a lethargy towards it. And I get the church is not, if you've been around church for a while, you know that it's not perfect. It struggles. It's supposed to be, the church, she's supposed to be this beautiful bride, this stunning bride of Christ, and she looks sometimes more like Shrek, and I get that. And but what I would say is God has chosen the church. Church is the bride of Christ. You can't love Jesus and despise His wife. And so God has chosen the church to make known His manifold wisdom. Yet what we see is not just that the church is the chosen instrument of God, but the chosen instrument of God for the advance of His work has been scripturally and historically the planting of new churches. And it's interesting, the Bible never says to plant churches. Actually, there's no specific command. You can go to 2 Opinions chapter 4, verse 11, and maybe find it there. But there's no specific command to plant churches. So why am I so passionate about it? Because it's interesting, because upon hearing the commissions of Jesus, right? John 20:21, Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. And then Matthew 28, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all I commanded you, and surely I'm with you always to the end of the age. And then He gives us Luke 24, 46 through 48, and He says that repentance and forgiveness of sins were proclaimed in His name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. Then He gives us Acts 1:8, and the Holy Spirit shall come upon you to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the earth. 4 commissions, right? 4 commissions of Jesus. And yet what's remarkable is, upon hearing those commissions, the disciples did something, and that's worthy of our note. The disciples, upon hearing those commissions, did this crazy thing. They went out and planted churches. Now, I want you to notice that. So, because sometimes we get, well, there's no biblical command to plant churches. Great, I get that. But the response of the disciples to the commissions of Jesus was the creation of congregations. And of course, Chuck has already shared a little bit about how even the name of the conference, to re-engage, how this movement was birthed and grown, and still has, compared to a lot of denominations, has a decent, even an above average church planting. But I don't want you just to be above average, right? I want you to even be beyond that, and perhaps to re-engage at even a higher level. So how do we get there? Well, part of what my journey is I do research on churches and culture. We've done research for different denominations, the Foursquare, for Assemblies of God, Southern Baptists, Wesleyans. So we do research, and also we do research just on churches. And we did some substantial research on church planting. There's a group you may have heard of. It's called Leadership Network. And Leadership Network is a kind of a donor-run organization. I'll explain why that's important in just a moment. But they have created a lot of resources, a lot of training events. Well, one of their donors asked one of their key leaders, who's getting it done in church planting in the United States today, specifically the U.S.? And that person said, well, I don't know. And said, well, how can we find out? So, well, let's do a research project. And so they hired us to kind of look into this. And so we actually did the largest research project ever of its kind done in church planting. We studied every major denomination and minor denominations. We surveyed churches. I read every book written on church planting in the English language since 1952. We went through and read all the dissertations, summarized them, put them all together to learn what we could about this area of church planting. And then I actually looked and said, here's what different movements are doing. Here's what's doing well. Here's what's doing poorly. We ranked them. Here are the 10 leading denominations or networks. And we also looked at some of those that weren't doing so well. And that'll actually never be published. I turned that into them. It's 450 pages. But what we did is, because you don't want to list the people who weren't, you don't want to shame people, right? But instead what they did is they took it and they took out the good things we learned, not the evaluative things, which were good and helpful, but the good things we learned, and said, well, here's what we saw in viral churches. And so that's the book Warren Bird and I wrote together called Viral Churches. And I'm going to share some of what we learned in viral churches tonight, kind of in seminar format with you as we kind of walk through that together. So I want to just kind of walk through. Part of this drew in my PhD dissertation. After I became a seminary professor, I wasn't a seminary professor for long, found out that it didn't suit me. And so I was there for 3 years, but while I was there, I did a PhD, and my PhD was in a field called missiology, which is the study of how the gospel advances mission, culture, church. And my PhD dissertation was on, an exciting name, the efficacy of church planting systems. And so me and 3 other people were excited about reading that dissertation. But it made me very passionate about these issues. And so that and some of the research we did, let me share together some things we learned about how we might engage in church planting together. Just some things I'll walk through. I've got a series of bullet points I'm going to walk through. First is that movements that get movemental reproduction have these characteristics. Movements, you can name yourself a movement all day. Right, you can say we're a movement, and I get that. People do that all the time. They don't want to be called a denomination. I was speaking at the Assemblies of God a couple of months ago, and at their headquarters in their chapel, and a huge building, got a seminary down the road, all this sort of stuff. But they don't like to be called a denomination. They say we're a movement. We're not a denomination. And so I said to them in chapel, and denial is not just a river in Egypt. You're a denomination. Embrace it. And they threw me out. And But again, so movements, I'm going to use that broadly because you're a fellowship of churches, a network of churches, but movements like yours that want to have movemental reproduction have certain characteristics. One of them is they actually have a culture of reproduction. If you're taking notes, you can jot these down. A culture of reproduction. They even give you a place in your notebook. A culture of reproduction is something that you both have and you propagate. You both have and you propagate. A culture of reproduction means that it is the normal practice of churches in your movement to reproduce. Now, I want you to hear, though, that the normal practice of churches in your movement to reproduce is something that wanes. It comes and it goes. For example, if you look back to Pentecostalism in the 20s and the 30s, right, the movement kind of explodes out of Azusa, spreading across the United States, and then eventually the world to become become really the Pentecostal charismatic movement and the whole continuous movement, the fastest growing movement in the history of world Christianity. Grows faster than the first century church, faster than the second century church. The fastest growing movement in the history of global Christianity is what we're experiencing right now in the continualist Pentecostal charismatic movement. And so we see this explosion, but we've also seen that slow down here in the United States. Whereas Pentecostalism is exploding around the world, right? I've had the privilege just recently being in Brazil, seeing this explosion of Pentecostalism. Not all of it, my Pentecostal friends here in the States would say, they would theologically affirm. It's not all stuff we would say, okay, this is all great. There's other movements that are within the movement. But to see this explosion around the world, but it's slowed here. Why? Because what's happened is that movements begin, they grow with great energy, they exponentially reproduce, but every movement eventually sees its reproductive capacity diminished. It's just the normal order of things that eventually, over time, the movement's reproductive capacity actually diminishes. Jose, let me see if I can do a favor. Would you lend me your name tag for a second? I need it for an illustration. Okay, unless you have a yo-yo. Does anybody have a yo-yo? Okay, it would kind of creep me out if you did, but I'm going to use this, and we're going to pretend this is a yo-yo. And so please forgive me. Just take a moment. Here's what happens over time. Is every movement starts, particularly if it's a real movement, where there's just people being redeemed by the power of the gospel, people being saved, come to Christ, born again, churches are reproducing, people are being sent out. There's a great outward energy in that movement. And so you sort of think of this as a yo-yo. Now, obviously, it's not a yo-yo, but pretend it is. And so you think of this as a yo-yo. What happens is the movement starts small, right? It kind of explodes out of an area. And so what happens is it begins to gain momentum along the way. And as it gains momentum, it gets larger and larger. But what happens is it doesn't spin out of control because there are parts of the yo-yo that are supporting the outward momentum. There's the centrifugal force, the outward force. Now, if you took physics in college, I'm not using these terms technically, but the centrifugal force is the outward force of the movement, the movemental reproductive energy of a movement that explodes out of an area. People are excited about the proclamation of the gospel. People have often found a way to do church that they think is worth telling others about and reproducing across the landscape. And so there's this strong outward centrifugal energy. But what happens invariably is this, because you can't have that without having some support. Right? So what happens is the string is the support. Now, right now I'm planning a church, right? So about a little over a year ago, we decided to start a church. We know that to continue to reach lost people for Christ, continue to see people redeemed by the power of the gospel, we're going to have that outward centrifugal energy. But at the same time, we know that there's some centripetal energy as well. That's the string. Don't despise the string, by the way. Right? The string often gets the bad rap. But, we meet in a movie theater, right? So we started in this movie theater. We're having church in the movie theater. And yet every week, a group of our men show up at 7 in the morning to set up. I thank God for them because I don't want to do it. And I'm thankful that they get up and they do that. And sometimes I join them. I'm on the rotation. And so that's part of the string. We have a group of people who work with the children, right? In the children's ministry. They're all part of the string. But here's what I want you to see. Over time, every movement continues to go out, and the string gets larger in order to support the larger expansion of the movement. But here's what happens. Every movement, every church, eventually wakes up and says, we're spending most of our time on the string, and we've lost the outward centrifugal energy of the movement. And what happens is ministry has been largely defined by the support of what once was a reproducing mission. Does that make sense? So it's this inevitable progression that takes place. And so what is our task is to always push forward, not to despise the string, not to look down on the string, but to value it, but to recognize that it serves a role. Thank you. It serves a role and it serves a purpose, and that purpose is to have a balance where this continual reproduction, this centrifugal movemental focus is evident, and that requires a clear culture of multiplication in a movement. Now what happens is eventually some churches get tired of it. We don't want to do it anymore. Now you're here, you're at the church planning conference, right? So I'm preaching to the proverbial choir. But one of the challenges is that a movement over time eventually turns and becomes more inward, less outward in its focus. And so how do we balance that thing out? Got a little music? No, it's all good. What was the song though? What was the song?
I recorded the man singing.
You recorded the man singing. That was awesome. The men. That's actually illegal. Please don't record without permission. You're not recording me right now, are you? All right, I'm just checking. No, it's all good. Now I've mortified you, and my apologies. But it does make a nice transition to my next point. So let's talk some about that. When I steal ideas from people along the way. I've stolen ideas from your movement. I stole an idea from the Wesleyans a few years ago. I had the privilege of preaching their first national gathering. And one of the things they wanted me to preach on multiplication, and that's more of a sermon. I'm doing more of a seminar here, more of a sermon. And so I had the privilege of preaching on multiplication. And what I taught on, I was going to teach on church multiplication, but they said this. I stole it from them. Actually, I used it in my message as if it was my own because that's the kind of person I am. But here's what they said. They said, Ed, we don't want you to talk about church multiplication. See, when you have a culture of multiplication, everything multiplies. See, and this is so key. See, if the first thing we do is say to a church, hey, you need to multiply, but nothing's multiplying inside, it's a shock to the system. It's an overwhelming idea. But if we live in a culture where disciples are multiplying, groups are multiplying, ministries are multiplying, then we'll see in that culture also churches that are multiplying. But a culture of multiplication has to pervade any movement that wants to be a reproducing movement. A culture of multiplication, of reproduction, has to pervade any movement that wishes to be a truly reproducing movement. At every level, things have to multiply. Now, here's the challenge. Again, what happens is eventually the needs of the people kind of, and let's talk about a local church for just a second, right? Your church is growing, it's doing great, things are making progress, but all of a sudden one of the things you notice is you go from a new church, and all of a sudden you start growing as a church, right? So we're a little over a year old, right? And so we're running, I don't even know, 225, 230 people on a Sunday. Oh, you guys don't count. You're like against that, aren't you? Did I just offend you? Because I know you guys don't believe in that. But, all right, so sorry. Me neither. I think it's bad. They definitely didn't do that throughout the book of Numbers. So you know, our church now, we actually had a service Sunday because what's happened is that we've kind of attracted more customers of religious goods and services at our church than we'd like. So once in a while we kind of break open a spiritual can of stomp and we sort of talk about this, that, you know, we don't want you to come to our church to be a customer of the religious goods and services that are distributed here. And that's what happens. That's what happens over time. And the same thing happens in a movement is eventually some people say, we're not really part of the multiplication. We're sort of the ones that have arrived. We don't need to multiply any longer. So the culture of reproduction is a tough issue. And it leads us to the second thing. And that's, I want you to see, number two is, and we'll just kind of talk about these ideas, is the Antioch versus Jerusalem axis. Now I understand, I wasn't here for the earlier session, but I understand that you guys talk about Antioch and Ephesus, I think. And so if I don't think I'm teaching anything contrary, it's just a different idea built off of that. But let me show you something about the difference between Antioch and Jerusalem. A couple things. First, you know Christians were first called Christians at Antioch. Furthermore, it becomes the great sending church. And people want it. Matter of fact, you don't see a lot of people name their church. Now, you guys are mostly Calvary Chapels. No, that's not all of you. But in other denominations and movements, they pick names. Well, nobody hardly ever picks the name Jerusalem. And perhaps because it's too many letters, I don't know. But a lot of churches pick the name Antioch. I think of Antioch Bible Church, Antioch Christian Church, because Antioch's got a good reputation in the New Testament. Antioch becomes the first sending church. I was in Singapore a few years back, and the Singapore believers told me they wanted to be known as the Antioch of Asia, which I thought was awesome, but I had to tell them that Antioch is actually in Asia, so you can't actually be the Antioch of Asia. But that didn't seem to bother them. They had a plan. The geography wasn't the issue, and sorry, I got what they were saying. And but Antioch is known for sending people out. Now let's compare that to Jerusalem. Now, historically, Jerusalem, the only time we find Jerusalem sending people out is to check up on and get in trouble the churches that came out from Antioch. Have you ever noticed that? When people from Jerusalem come, it's not a good day at church. Somebody's going to get in trouble, right? So there are people sent out from Jerusalem, and we see that. And here's what's interesting. Historically, they have this council in Acts 15. All this takes place. Well, you know the Jerusalem church actually doesn't do well after the close of the canon of the New Testament. It actually reverts back in large measure into Judaism. It becomes what's called the Ebionite heresy. And at first it was tolerated in the church, later declared to be a heretical sect, and ultimately reverts back into Judaism. Why? Because really they didn't want to be part of the mission. And they instead wanted to be about themselves. And that leads, when you want to be about yourself, it leads to an unhealthy environment in church and mission. And so Antioch is the model we look for. Now, why is that important to you? Because if you're going to re-engage at Calvary Chapel at a higher and increased capacity for multiplication, what you're going to find is most churches in any movement aren't particularly interested in doing that. I want you to hear this. Most churches in any movement aren't particularly interested in doing that. I was with the Evangelical Free Church just a few weeks ago in Chicago, in Minneapolis, and we're kind of working with their national leaders. And here's what I told them, because they want to increase their church planning capacity, and I want them to. They're doing well, but they can do even better. But here's what I told them: if they have about a little over 1,000 churches, not dissimilar in size to your movement. And here's what I said: listen, if you guys come up with a plan, we had all the national leaders in the room for 2 days. If you guys come up with a great plan and you mobilize everyone, all of you agree in this room, and then the national leadership agrees, and then we do it at the national meeting. I'm going to have the privilege of preaching at their meeting in 2013, and we're going to talk about some of these issues. It doesn't. If you did all of that, 60% of your churches will ignore you and have no interest in what you're doing. And then if you go to those churches that ignore you and set yourself on fire in front of them, they will walk past you to go in because they're just doing what they've always done. See, what you have to hear, and I want to encourage you in, is that to create a church planting movement, you don't try to persuade the unpersuadable. You go with those who have a heart like the heart of Antioch. And what happens when you do that is the 60% begin to say, we're missing out on what God is doing. And so you begin to try to persuade the persuaded. We'll go with a coalition of the willing. To create any sort of focus in a movement, a denomination, a network, you create a coalition of the willing who want to create the necessary systems, engage and promote the necessary culture so that ultimately and inevitably multiplication comes among them, and then it influences the others as well. So how do you do that in your own life? Well, here's the thing. Third thing, if you're taking notes. If you want to do that here, you're here because you love church planning or you're interested in church planning at some level. The third thing is you have to model multiplication. You have to model multiplication. I'm a church planner, but I don't like to say that because I don't think that's fair to those of you who are planting churches where, for me, I have a job. I drive downtown to an office. I have a 10th floor office. Where many of you church planners, who are even bivocational church planners, you're working at the post office all week. And so I don't even like to classify myself as a bivocational church planner. But because I am planning a church, and I'm doing it, I have 8 to 15 hours a week to dedicate to the life of the church. Because I have 3 daughters, right? So you can pray for me right there. And they're young. I got a 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 14-year-old. I got a wonderful wife. I am rather fond of them, and so I want to spend time with them, and I'm not going to sacrifice them on the altar of church planning. And so I've got 8 to 15 hours a week that I can put into the church plant. And so I've got to decide, what am I going to do? Let me tell you what I've decided. And there's a point to this, not just so my personal experience, but to help along the way. First, I preach. So I preach 3 out of 4 Sundays. 1 out of 4 Sunday, I preach someone else's church. But 3 out of 4, so I guess my job at Lifeway Research, I need to be in other people's churches. But 3 out of 4 Sundays, I preach at my church. Right now, we're preaching through the Gospel of Matthew. We work like you do, verse by verse, through passages along the way. And so I do that. So I got to have sermon prep time. Number 2 is I meet with the staff. We meet once or twice a week. We have 2 full-time staff. They raise their own funds to come there. 1 other staff like me. I'm a volunteer, by the way. I'm not a part-time person. I'm just a volunteer. But I'm the lead pastor. And so I meet with the staff. The third thing I do, and the third thing is kind of part A and part B, is I lead a small group in my home. Now, why do I lead a small group in my home? I lead a small group in my home every Sunday night. Here's why. Because I have 8 neighbors within 2 houses of me who I've been intentionally seeking to reach for the gospel. And 7 of the 8 have now engaged at some level with our Bible study or with our church. We have now 1 who wasn't in church at all, committed his life to Christ, attending regularly. Another one back there didn't attend church at all. Husband was from Europe, very unchurched background. Now trust in the Lord. Actually going to a different church, a little more traditional than ours. Ours is a contemporary church. That wasn't really the culture with it, but now they're plugged in. Family over here to the right of us now, coming every week. They are not believers. They don't know the Lord, but they're talking to me. They're talking about the gospel. They're having questions. I recently talked about how to understand the Sermon on the Mount, and I talked about the hermeneutic bridge. You've heard this before, right? Hermeneutic bridge is, what did it mean to the original hearers? What's the universal underlying principle? What's it mean to us today? And so my neighbors in my backyard were standing back there. I built a little bridge over some stones, and my unchurched lost neighbor says, hey, is that the hermeneutic bridge? And she thought that was the funniest thing ever, that she knew what the and I did too. Why? Because I love hearing unchurched people ask me theological questions. And by the way, I believe if you can learn to order coffee at Starbucks, you can learn some theological language at church. So the fact that they can learn what the hermeneutic bridge is doable and possible and helpful. And so I look around, my neighbors, they need Jesus, and now 3 of them are in small group Bible study with me on a weekly basis. So why do that? Now, I could go write a book, I could go train another set of pastors, but here's why. I do that because I don't believe that I can lead what I don't live. I don't believe you can lead what you don't live. And what I would say is don't try to lead what you don't live. And so if you're going to seek to have a multiplying movement, you have to be a multiplying person, multiplying yourself. So this is key, right? A lot of pastors love evangelism as long as somebody else is doing it. And what I would say is that if you're not engaged in the multiplication of disciples, the multiplication of groups, don't expect to lead your church and then your movement to being a multiplying movement itself. You actually have to engage that. You have to model multiplication, from the beginning. What else? Okay, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Number 4 is this sounds like a strange one, but the 4th thing I want to encourage you to consider is to be born pregnant. That's very strange, I know, very, very strange. But it actually comes from probably one of the most important cultural moments in the history of American society. It's a Star Trek episode called The Trouble with Tribbles. Some of you remember that. It was actually written by a guy named David Gerald. And the fact that I know that kind of scares me. But if you remember, the Trouble with Tribbles, you probably remember, everyone saw it. These little animals, little furry animals, kept reproducing everywhere, right? And I won't give you the whole story, but they kind of saved the planet. They ate all the grain that was poisoned. The Klingons got caught. Blah 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 blah. And but they were taking over everywhere. They were growing, they're multiplying everywhere. That's what I want for your movement, right? I want Calvary Chapels to multiply everywhere. They're multiplying all over the place. And so finally, what are they going to do? They're filling up the ship. They're just everything everywhere. And so the doctor, DeForest Kelly Bones in the show, he comes in and says, Jim, I figured it out. And I know I just knew the names of the actors. I know what you're thinking, and I just want to embrace that. It's true. So he said, so I figured out how you can stop this. And Captain Kirk says, how? And he says, here's the problem. You just have to stop feeding them because they're all born pregnant. See, I want you to hear this. Is that if you're going to be a movement of church plants, the plants you're planting now have to have within them another plant before they plant. See, this is key. Everyone says, I don't want to plant a church, I want to plant a movement of churches. But nobody does it. I mean, it's a great aspirational value that we don't often actualize. Matter of fact, it's funny, this is how I end up a seminary professor. Again, one of the things in my life that I wish I could do over, I didn't make a good seminary professor, is I was planting a church in Erie, Pennsylvania. And we, on our 3rd anniversary, planted 2 daughter churches. And so we were running about 400 or so at the mother church. We planted 2 daughter churches, and so we had these three churches that we started. And so right then, people called me up and said, "Hey, could you teach church planting?" And I said, "Why? I mean, we just planted 1 church, and now we planted 2 daughter churches." And they said, "That's what you told us to do." I told one of our leaders in our movement, I said, "That's what you told me to do." I said, we should plant a church within 3 years. And so I did what you told me to do. So why should I now be a professor of this? And he says, yeah, we tell everyone to do that, but nobody actually does. And what I'm saying, that's one of the great challenges, is that what I want to say to you is when you plant a church, don't have the aspirational value, have the plan from the beginning. So let me tell you just how we try to do that. We have, from the first Sunday, the first giving, we put 10% of our giving to kind of a global missions endeavor. We sent 3% to a local missions endeavor, and then we have 7% set apart right now for local church planting. And I meet with 3 men right now that I'm training. I call my pastoral apprentice team, who will go out and be pastors or church planners. And that's, by the way, I said there were 2 parts of number 3. Remember, I lead my small group, and I also lead a pastoral apprentice team. Why? Because those are the ones that we want to send out. And so what we're doing within the next year is planting a daughter church, actually less than next year, out of our church. Why? Because we want to be born pregnant. And what I want to say to you is this: if you can create the expectation in your movement that people will plant churches, and then within a year or 2, they're already engaged in planting more churches, then what happens is those become Antioch churches that plant more churches, and soon you've got this reproductive capacity, which is not dissimilar to what you looked like historically, but to be honest, look a little less like today. Now again, I'm still your friend. I love you. You know that, right? I love you. I've got a man crush on the Calvary Chapel. But you look back at some of the movements that were birthed during that same era. The Vineyard. The last time I led a movement meeting was actually 2 days with the Vineyard leadership in San Diego. You think Vineyard, Calvary Chapel, all these movements were just exploding with growth in the 80s and the 90s, and still growing today, and I thank God for it. But the Vineyard folks said that what they wanted me to talk on, it was kind of a technical, missiological description, is how do they get their mojo back? It's technical. It's a technical term. It's in a missiology textbook I wrote. And I love that passion. And what I would say is this, is that part of any movement to keep focused on that is for them to recognize that their churches need to be born pregnant and to live that way accordingly. Let me talk about something else that may happen too, that may be helpful too, is the next issue, number 5. I didn't number them, so I'm reading down my list. What is that, number 5? Yes. Okay, I'm going to put a 5 there so I can remember. Is to give permission. It's a scary thing. Movements get nervous when you give permission, but one of the things that happens when movements experience this rapid reproduction is there are movements that have given permission to people to plant churches. Let me give an example, historic example. The last time, there's a phrase most of you probably heard it called a church planting movement. It was coined by a guy, or popularized by a guy named David Garrison. David wrote a book by that name, a couple books by that name. As a matter of fact, David and I are emailing today. He's a friend where I host a leadership meeting of all the national network and denomination leaders twice a year at my offices in Lifeway. And David will be speaking at that. But David wrote this, and a church planting movement is a rapid reproducing movement of indigenous churches among a given population group or people group or population segment. And we see them around the world where literally hundreds of churches are planted a year. They explode, and there's rapid, just amazing reproduction. But we haven't seen that here in the soil of what's the United States for a long time. But we have seen it. Historically. In 1795 to 1810, in places called Kentucky and Tennessee, that was the western frontier then, we had this a church planting movement take place on our soil. It was related to a Great Awakening, but it preceded it and went after it. So it wasn't just a Great Awakening. But during those 15 years, 1795 to 1810, 3,000 churches were planted on the western frontier of the United States. Now, again, think of the western frontier as Kentucky, Indiana, some degree Indiana, mostly Tennessee. Nothing was there. But all of a sudden, 3,000 churches were planted in 15 years. So, amazing, right? You're talking about 500 churches in 5 years. That's awesome. But imagine, and you're talking here, this huge explosion from nothing to 3,000 churches. And so what happened? Well, there were two groups. There were the Methodists and the Baptists. And what was interesting was they sort of planted churches similarly. But they didn't think they did. The Methodists were sacramental to some degree, more so then than they are now. And they thought that they needed a pastor who was an ordained pastor to do the elements, the Lord's Supper, and so they would have to have a pastor go around, where the Baptists didn't. The Baptists didn't think so. They thought if they found a young man, he was ready to preach, they'd license him to preach, they'd give him permission, he'd go out and plant a church and just go to it and get it done. And so the Baptists, an historian named William Warren Sweet called them the Baptist farmer preacher. And so he'd farm all week, and on Saturday night they'd have a church meeting, and then Sunday morning they'd have a church service, and that was the Baptist farmer preacher. The Methodists didn't do it that way because, remember, they thought they needed somebody to oversee them all. And so they created what are called class leaders, and the end result, though, is they created somebody who oversaw those classes, which are really churches, and that person was called a circuit rider. You know that, circuit rider, you've heard that? Excuse me. So, bottle of water back here, I thought. There was a bottle of water. Someone got a bottle of water? That one's already been consumed. Someone got a bottle of water I can steal? Someone's got back there? Here we go. You're the man. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that, Jesus. Is it just me, or did you notice that as well? The Passion Play. He must always be busy during the Passion Play season. He just left. He's gone. He's like, I don't want to be compared to the Lord. Well, I understand. So they planted. It was simple. You know what it was? Later on, the Anglicans, someone from the Anglicans would ask, how do you Baptists plant so many churches on the frontier? And this Baptist leader up in Rhode Island said, because we don't wait for permission. We've already been given. People have been given permission. But what happens over time, as the string gets thicker, the movement, centripetal's energy is out, the string is thicker that supports it, the requirements for being a church planter increase and grow and grow and grow until the point where basically church planting is turned into a professional clergy enterprise. And the clergification of church planting is almost always the death of church planting. Let me say it again. The clergification of church planting is almost always the death of church planting. That's why people like Roland Allen would write books, and this is decades and decades ago, called The Case for Voluntary Clergy. Or he wrote a book called the Spontaneous Expansion of the Church and Causes That Hinder It. Or his most famous book was Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours. And he had this crazy idea. He was an Anglican, right? He had this crazy idea that if we trusted the Holy Spirit and gave people permission to plant churches, qualified people who met the 1 Timothy 3 qualifications of pastoral leadership, but if we just trusted the Holy Spirit and sent them out, that they might actually do the crazy things people did in the New Testament. Wouldn't that just be crazy? Or we could create a bunch of rules and thicken the string that supports the mission. So there's this reality that giving permission is hard. Giving permission is hard, but one of the things we have to do for a movement to be successful is to have that sense of permission. I was sitting with Johnny Christ. He's the pastor of the Atlanta Vineyard. And they've planted 22 daughter churches out of their church since he planted his church in the early 1980s. And I said, Johnny, how did you get here? And he said, well, John Wimber told me to come. I said, that's it? I mean, there wasn't like, so yeah. He said, John just turned to me and said, you look like you could go to Atlanta to plant a church. And they did. And they didn't need to get permission. This is one of the reasons why Pentecostals were so successful in planting churches in the early part of the last century, is that when the Spirit was on somebody, two things took place. Number one, they knew they were anointed, and number two, they knew they needed a Spirit-filled church in that town. And so people go out and plant churches there. Why? Because they had permission to do so. So give permission. Number 6 is open more lanes. Open more lanes. Now, what does that mean? I go to Walmart as infrequently as possible. And it's always, and it's interesting. I go on Saturday. Don't go to Walmart on Saturday. And if you do, bring a camera because the folks at peopleofwalmart.com would love your pictures. And it's always fascinating, the people that are there. And I'm kind of a people watcher. And so at the end of my little shopping escapade, I get into the line. And we have a super Walmart, right? So it's like 20 lanes long, but only one of them is open. You know it is. Well, there's the self-service lane, which never works, right? And so I'm there, and that one lane that's open has 15 people lined up in it, right? And so you're standing back there, and you're just like, waiting. And you're thinking to yourself, what's the deal? Here's the thing I want you to hear. This may be one of the more important things I say to you today, is that we have a good number of people waiting in the lane for vocational funded church planting. And I'm thankful for them. I never begrudge church planters financial resources, right? When I did my PhD dissertation, we studied 602 church planters, looked at them over a four-year kind of span. And I got to tell you, I'd have them write some freehand comments at the end, and it broke my heart to hear some of the sacrifices people made. And yet, what we found is this. At the end, we studied the amount of money that we gave them had no proportional relationship to the success, failure, and growth of their church. Isn't that interesting? So, open these lanes, because right now we think the only way to plant a church is funded. Right now the big thing is you can only plant a church if you're funded and if you have a team. I remember a few years ago, there was a well-known speaker, you know this well-known speaker, and he said, if I said his name, you'd know him. He was very well-known. He said, don't even think about planting a church until you have $100,000 in the bank. I've never even seen $100,000 in the bank. I planted my first church, and my denomination turned me down to be a church planter. I was 21. I would have turned me down. My biology and chemistry degree didn't prepare me well But in my movement's a movement of autonomous churches like yours, and so I just moved up there and started planning a church. And the irony would be that later I would be the guy who would actually turn people down. So the irony of that was there very clearly. So I blew insulation. I blew insulation during the week. That's how I supported my family and didn't necessarily support a lot. Donna got a job as well. We worked together and we planted a church. Now here's what I want you to hear, is that I was in a new lane. My lane was this. My lane was lay bivocational church planting. Because by lay, I mean, I was ordained, but, the ordination process in my denomination is very, we can ordain a house plant. And so I was ordained, and I was pretty close. So I was ordained, but I was bivocational. So my lane, here's what I want to say, is that a lot of people think the answer to church planting is more money. I want more money in church planting. That's not the answer. You cannot buy your way into a church multiplication movement. You just can't. There's not enough money in the world. My denominational family decided that in order to increase our capacity of church planting, we were going to have some really, really, really heavy hitter church planters. So we funded, I think it was 8 church plants, where we basically funded them at $500,000 per church plant, right? $250,000 from a big honking mega church and $250,000 from a mission agency, and we'd send them on out and go plant a church. And you know what we found? We found that it didn't make that much of a difference if we funded them at $250,000 each, or $500,000 per plant, or multiple staff members, et cetera, or if we funded them at a lower level. Now, I know what you're thinking. Let me try. Amen. I heard that. But what I would say is this, because I ran a program. We actually sent out 122 church planters the last year I was there. We funded them at a much lower level. We tried to get them insurance and just not a lot of resources. And our success rate was about the same as those that got $500,000. Now why? Because one of the keys is this. Funding's not the panacea that people make it out to be. One of the keys, if you want a movement, is you got to open more lanes, not just the one vocational pastor lane. You got to have bivocational church planters. Okay? You've got to also have lay church planters. You got to have different, and I would say too, this is going to get tricky. I might offend you, and I don't want to. Well, maybe a little. You might have different expressions of church. Here's the thing: not everyone wants to plant a church that looks like this room. Where we line up in rows, like shelves at Walmart, and face forward. Some want to plant, missional incarnational communities, where people are hearing the gospel, responding, and they're in small faith communities that instead of growing large, instead of expanding, they multiply. And there's another one over here, there's another one over here, another one over here. And yeah, I get that they sound different, right? They can hold Calvary Chapel doctrine and distinctives, but they begin to talk about, well, we're a missional incarnational community of Christ followers, because they've been to One Too Many Alan Hirsch conference. And they talk a little different, and they sound a little, and you know what? But they hold our doctrine, our distinctives, and our philosophy of ministry. And so what do we do then? You know what we do? We open another lane. And so we've got a lane for this, and we've got a lane for lay, and we've got a lane for bivocational, we've got a lane for ethnic. And what about that? Most of the movements that are successfully planting churches today are planting churches among people who are not Anglos. In the largest denominations, it's not Anglos. What about a strong Latino presence where there's explosion of church planting, where we're seeing a movement of God in many Latino communities today? How do we see that? What about among African Americans? We're just releasing the largest research project of its kind ever done on African American church planting at our upcoming Church Planting Leadership Fellowship in November. I'm looking at the data now. Fascinating things. Another lane. We got to find as many lanes to open as we can. But that leads to the next thing. Number 7. You have to support the planners. See, but I'm not talking about the quan. I'm not talking about the money, though that too. What I'm talking about is the systems. It's the systems. How long am I supposed to go, Chuck? A little after 9? That's not true. You told me 8:45, didn't you? So in conclusion, support planters. You guys go to movies, right? Sometimes I speak to some groups, they don't go to movies. You look like movie-going pagans. You got tattoos and facial jewelry. Yeah, okay, you go to movies. See, some people, sometimes I got to tell the story, and I got to tell it like. So I've heard there's this movie, so I haven't been, but if you go to the I did the national series of national meetings for the International Pentecostal Holiness Churches. Great group. Sounds scarier than they are. They're wonderful. But just like the Assemblies of God, there's three Pentecostal denominations: the AG, Church of God Cleveland, IPHC, but they don't go to movies. And so I kind of tiptoed around this illustration. But if you saw Saving Private Ryan, if hypothetically you had gone to Saving Private Ryan, which I have not, but if you had seen this rated R movie as a Christian, we're not recording this, are we? But the kind of the beginning scene, right? There's this Captain Miller. That's Tom Hanks, the Tom Hanks character, and they come up and they bring these boats, these amphibious creatures. They're called the ducks, by the way. And the ducks would come up. They're amphibious landing vehicles, and they would open up, and the people could be shocked because they were right there exposed. That's where we get the expression, by the way, sitting ducks, is because they would open up the ducks and they'd be sitting there and they'd be shot and they'd all be killed because now they have no protection. But you remember in the movie, so they jump out and they get into the water and they try to get to the shore, but it's brutal. I mean, it's the machine gun fire. You've got pillboxes with the Germans, and people are just getting mowed down, and they don't hold anything back. I mean, this is what it looks like in a real war. And so my wife turns away, if hypothetically we had gone to the movie, and so she's looking, and they get up to the first thing of the beach, and the bullets are flying, and people are dying, and they get up to the second hill of the beach, a little indentation in the sand, and then now Captain Miller, most of his men are dead, but he's kind of regrouped. They got 3 or 4, 5 or 6 of them, but the problem is there's a pillbox. A pillbox is like a cinder block with a little hole in it with a machine gun, and if they don't get there, more people are dying. The sitting ducks are getting shot. And so Miller, he's in charge, so he looks to his sergeant and he says, two men. And he points, and the sergeant points at 2 men, and they stand up and they start, and as soon as they stand up, they're just mowed down. I mean, horrible. And Miller, but he's got to take this pillbox. So he says, how I remember it, I'm sure exactly right, but Miller goes to the sergeant and says, 2 more! And they stand up and just immediately shot down. And so he says, we got to do this. And so he's looking at the sergeant going, you're killing them! And he said, 2 more. And then what happens is this guy gets up, and he's one of the people throughout the sharpshooter who goes up on the tower and all that. He gets up, he sits down, he points, and boom, he gets the lucky shot off. And there's 8 dead, but 1 guy gets a lucky shot off. See, that's what church planting looked like in the 1980s. A lot of people went into it, failed, and suffered greatly. I was sent to Buffalo, New York at the same time as 7 others were sent to Buffalo, New York. There were 8 of us in a cohort of church planters. It was an emphasis in our denominational family to plant churches in that city. And today, of those 8 churches that were planted, only one's left. Of those, to my knowledge, 5 of them are out of the ministry, 4 of them are out of their marriages, and I think it's 3 or 4 of them are out of the faith. Because there was no support system. See, one of the things that I would encourage you to consider is this, is that what you see as unorganic structures and systems, planters see as a life preserver. Because planting is hard. And if you don't have a support system, and let me tell you a little bit about how you can support planters. One is with assessment. The idea, see, not everybody can plant a church. And that's not a bad thing. Listen, I've preached for some of the greatest pastors in America. I've been privileged to be in their pulpits, and they would say to me, "I cannot imagine planting a church because they're not gifted and wired that way. They're great communicators, but there's a different set of gifting. Church planters are different. We've done a study of church planters." And this is the largest study ever done. I like to say that a lot because we actually do a lot of larger studies. But we found we can actually measure the attributes of church planters. We have a church planter candidate assessment online validated tool. 14 denominations help resource us to do it. And what we found is there are church planter personalities. Now, it's not always what you think. Right? It's like some of you are kind of used car salesmen. That's the way I am. I'm like the church planter. Hey, let's all go plant a church. You want to come, don't you? And some of you aren't like that. See, introverts can plant a church, right? But they plant a church differently, but there's also commonalities. Let me give you an example. If you have never started anything in your life, a church is not the first time to try that. No, I'm serious. I hear it all the time. Well, I'm sorry, the Lord's called me to plant a church. Well, what have you started before now? Well, nothing, but this is going to be a beginning. If you're not seeing people come to Christ, if you're not winning your neighbors to Jesus, you're going to think you're going to plant an evangelistic church. This is not real. It's not realistic. It's not reasonable. It's not going to happen. And so what assessments do, if you're going to support planters, assess them. Do not send somebody out to plant a church who God has not wired and gifted to plant a church. You are not being a good steward of your pastors if that's the way you do it. You're sending them out like soldiers without firearms to be mowed down in the battle. In the spiritual battle is church planting. Church planting will be the hardest thing you ever do. And you know that. Some of you already planted church. You already know that to be the case. So we support them through assessment, right? Assessment. Now, but that's not all. What about basic training? What about a boot camp experience? Listen, in the PhD research I did, 602 church planters. I'm trying to remember the exact number, and I'm probably going to forget. 87% of statistics are made up on the spot, so let me put one out. Not mine, but I mean other people's are. I lead a research company. Every time I quote a statistic, an angel gets its wings. But when I did a study, here's what we did. We compared the program I ran was predominantly seminary graduates, so people getting masters in divinities. And not all. You could have a Bible college degree, but you were basically finishing a program going out and plant a church. And so I tracked and compared those who went to seminary and then took a 3-day church planting preparation seminar, and those who went to seminary and didn't take a 3-day church planting preparation seminar, right? So 3 years of getting your MDiv. I've never met anyone who actually finished it in 3 years, but allegedly it can be done. And so 3 years of getting an MDiv. It's like some of you have that, right? How many of you have a Master in Divinity? Raise your hand for a second. Anybody? Several of you. Okay. All right. 3 years, right? Where'd you go to school? Southwestern. All right, you went to Southwestern Seminary, 3 years. What's your name? John. Okay. John goes to seminary 3 years, and then he goes out and plants a church without a church planting 3-day seminar. His church is about half the size 4 years later. Now that's pretty significant. What does that tell you? The things you learn in seminary aren't always the things that you go out and plant churches with. Right? And I've been a seminary professor. I know this to be the case. So what I would say, let's support church planters. How? Assess them. Give them a boot camp training. And by the way, give them a boot camp that actually includes your values. Right? I'm a real defender of the values of movements. I don't think you should. I think you should have a set. This is what we believe. This is where we are, and we're going to pass that on. So I've had the privilege of speaking at other people's boot camps, and what I say to them is, I'd be happy to do that. I can teach people about evangelism. I can teach people this, but only you can teach people about the values of your movement. And I think as Calvary Chapel, you have values that are worth passing on. And but that's not it, right? So we assess them. Now we're putting them in basic training and boot camp. Sorry for the militaristic language, but again, training them. But then what after that? What about coaching? What about the ongoing relationships that are there? Successful church planters are coached church planters. See, I want you to hear this. If you love church planting, you have to love church planters. And if you're going to love church planters, you're going to find the means to support them. The Evangelical Free Church has a slogan. No church planter left behind. I like that. None left alone. So supporting planters requires systems. The Assemblies of God, we did a 2-day meeting in Nashville when we started the conversation. I was a consultant with the AG. Talk about how do they increase their church planting capacity. Steve Pike was new to the role, was doing a great job. And they have been planting, doing okay, lower than the average, lower than they wanted to be. And got together, and here's what they said to do. We can't do everything, but here's one thing we can do. We can support our church planters. And since then, their church planting capacity has increased remarkably. They're now planting more than one church a day in the United States in the Assemblies of God. So again, support planters. What else? Here's another. Let churches lead. What's that, 8? Let churches lead. My pen's died. This I don't think is a hard one for you, but I'm doing sort of this. This is the seminar I do when I train and talk to movement leaders about how to increase capacity for church planting. But what happens sometimes is church planting kind of gets focused and kind of emanates out from the central office. It won't work. But here's the problem. If you let you're kind of in a movement of autonomous churches. You got a lot of strong-willed. No, that's not a bad thing, but you do. You got a lot of strong-willed, high recognition, name recognition pastors, and then each individual local church pastor as well. What I would say is this, is letting churches lead doesn't mean, here's what they say, well, in our movement, churches plant churches. And when that becomes an excuse, it's time to challenge that excuse. See, what do I mean by an excuse? What I mean is this. People say, well, we can't get our churches to plant churches because churches plant churches. Sure you can. You know what you need to do? You need to do Hebrews 10:24. It says, provoke one another to love and good deeds. So who's provoking the churches? Who's provoking the churches to multiply as God intended to multiply? When did it become okay for your church, you can say to anyone, when did it become okay for your church to become a cul-de-sac on the Great Commission Highway? Because that's what happens. Someone planted that church. When did it become okay to say, thank you, Lord, we've arrived, we're not going to reproduce? By the way, did you know that all healthy things multiply? It's a sign of life. Now, again, I'm not making this universal statement that you're dead if you don't have children. But what I would say, it's a sign of life, multiplication. And yet, in the midst of all that, churches have to lead. But when churches don't lead, you have to provoke churches to love and good deeds. Number 9, I'm going to give you 10. Celebrate multiplication. You know, I mentioned the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, and we all kind of snickered at the name. Can I tell you a little something? They actually plant at a higher rate than the Calvary Chapel does, even with that crazy name. Now, most of the churches don't call themselves the First International Pentecostal Holiness Church of God of the Living Christ, number 4. You've seen that church, have you? But they have about 10% planting of their churches. Their daughter churches, so they have 1,000 churches. They're going to plant 100 more churches. They're in a golden season in the growth of their movement. And Pentecostalism, one of the few movements that's actually growing and in vibrant growth right now is the International Pentecostal Holiness Church. And one of the reasons is if you go on my blog, if any of you read my blog, if you actually just search IPHC, you'll come up with a picture of a little graphic that I took of their. When I spoke at their meetings, they gave me a pin, and it was kind of interesting. They gave me a little pin. And it said on there, church planter. And I said, how do you get that pin? You plant a church. It's the only way you can get that pin. And we ask you to wear it at the meetings when we gather together. And then there's another pin, and it's church planting church. I said, how do you get that pin? You got to plant a church. And when you plant one church, you get the pin. But then when you plant 2 churches, you get a pin that's got 2 diamonds in it. And you get 3 churches, and it's a 3, 4, 5. And then you finally, and I think finally you look like a Russian general with all these pins and all this. But you know what? It's a silly thing, but it's a marvelous thing because they're celebrating church planting at their movement. When they get together, I just seriously 3 meetings across the country with their 3 regional meetings, and we celebrate church planting every one of them. Why? Because here's the thing: what you celebrate, you become. Amen. See, some movements they celebrate 1,000 other things. They're good things. They can celebrate church health. Some movements celebrate doctrine. I'm a very doctrinally driven person. Some movements celebrate this, but if those are the only things you celebrate, then what you become is if you only celebrate doctrine, you become doctrinaire. And sometimes you become conflicted and filled with conflict that grows out of that. But when you celebrate church planting, you become that. And so think about this. If you want to re-engage at a higher level Calvary Chapel church planting, what does it look like for the regional meetings, the National Pastors Conference, the Bible College, the expressions that come out to be celebrating of church planting? This is when I've been working with the Foursquare for about 4 years, kind of as a coach to their movement. We kind of walked through this journey together. But Jack Hayford was the president, or most of the time when I was consulting. He and Glenn Burris asked me to help walk through that journey with them. One of the things we had to say, Jack talks, and I just start repenting. I haven't even done anything, and I'm like, I don't know what it is, but I'm wrong. He is so much more godly than I am, and I love him for it. I recently released a study Bible, the Mission of God Study Bible, and I asked Jack to be one of the contributors, and he wrote a wonderful, wonderful article as kind of a letter to the church in the study Bible I'm the general editor of. But one of the things Jack says is, here's what he said. He said, I need you guys to tell me what I'm supposed to say about church planting so I can fly this flag. See, part of the things we have to do is, if we're going to celebrate it, is we have to make sure that the leaders of the movement, all of us together, celebrate it, and that's what we're talking about. That's the consistent message that is coming forth, is we value multiplication. We want more, not less. Which leads to number 10, and finally, and I'll close with this. You know what it means when a guest speaker says that? Absolutely nothing. But it's like 11 o'clock real time. So you guys are all West Coasters. These West Coast denominations. You guys and the Foursquare, godless pagans. Central time is the greatest time. I'm actually a New Yorker, by the way. I'm not from that. I was born in Long Island, grew up outside of New York City. But Central Time is just awesome because you get to watch Leno at a reasonable hour. Not that I watch television or anything of that sort. Sometimes, what group am I with? I think that's okay with you guys. You're probably up watching television and smoking a stogie. Sorry, I don't know the rules. Lastly, and finally for tonight, if you're going to be a movement, you have to welcome the planter. To welcome the planter. This is a tricky one. Can I just tell you? Church planters are an odd lot. Studies show, I shouldn't say studies show, people who work in this field tell me that pastors are less psychologically healthy than most normal Americans. They go in the ministry, try to find themselves, maybe minister to others, et cetera, et cetera. They got some issues. But as one counselor put it this way, church planters make pastors look really healthy. Yeah, you enjoyed that one back there a little more than I expected. You're like, amen. That your husband over there, you can relate to that. I understand. And for me, I own this. I embrace this. Listen, but I want you to hear this. You have to be careful, church planters, because the desires that drive you can become the demons that drag you down. This overwhelming need to innovate and be an entrepreneur and plant and start something new can really undermine and really destroy your soul. And I've seen it happen. You've seen it happen as well. But part of that happens in movements itself. Here's some of the things that happen. For example, many times in movements, church planters are actually seen as competition for the churches that they followed after. It's like, wait a second. How is this? How are you coming here? And you're not, and not only competition, but they're often seen because they tend to do things differently. Listen, if you're doing things the exact same way you did it 40 years ago, then you have this question, because 40 years ago, every church then said, we're going to engage our culture around us. And that's one of the things that Calvary Chapel and other movements were known for, engaging the culture around us. But that culture has changed in 40 years. So if the impulse was the same, we're going to engage the culture, we're going to do so in biblically faithful and discerning ways. One of the reasons I love the Calvary Chapel is that it actually mattered to you, is we're going to engage the culture, but we're going to do so in biblically discerning way with deep teaching and preaching, et cetera, et cetera. But now we find ourselves this. And so now church planters are doing it differently. And what happens is it often is seen as an affront to the established churches of a movement. What happens is church planters get that message. And if you don't welcome the planter feels unwelcome, the planter will go somewhere else. Now, I want you to know, I take a lot of arrows for church planters. Matter of fact, probably the most controversial things in my life that have come up have been because I stood up with and mentored and encouraged church planters who said or did controversial things. But you know what? I'll do it again. See, now I'm old. So, I'm 46. So I don't get to, that's not old to some of you, is it? Sorry. It's old to some of you. It's not old to some of you as well. In my denomination, I'm still a young leader. But what I would say is this, is that I'm not a young pastor anymore, but I want my movement to be known, and I want your movement to be known as the kind of place that's safe for young entrepreneurial church planters. And that means sometimes you're going to have to stand up to the bullies from the Jerusalem church and say, no, they're with us, and we're proud that they're here. Now, that's not always easy, because they do dumb things. Now, in the Bible, young men in the Bible have one unique characteristic. They're the ones doing the stupid stuff. Do you ever notice that? The Bible never says good things about the advice of young men. Have you ever noticed that? Every time the advice is taken, the kingdom is overthrown. Somebody loses their life. We get this one verse, let no one be ashamed of you because you're youth. And we build the whole theology on it. Read the rest of the Bible. Young men do not do well. But you know what Paul was doing? He was saying, don't let them be ashamed of you. Don't let them give you any shine about your ponytail. He said, don't let them give you hassle because you look different. Why? Because if you're going to have a movement, church planters are going to be on the edge of any movement. This is important. Church planters are going to be at the edge of any movement. Now, your movement was actually started on the edge. right? You were on the edge. But what happens is eventually the edge becomes the center, but then church planters go out to the edge. Now here's the thing. Here's where it's scary. Here's where it's scary for theologically minded people like you and like me. I don't want my church planters to do a whole lot of theological innovation. You know, I think we saw people even try that not that long ago in the emergent movement that kind of came and flamed out because it kind of jettisoned out of evangelicalism, and now in a lot of ways it's the avant-garde wing of mainline Protestantism. And so I look at that, and as one, I wrote some articles, some critical articles, some of the defining articles about what that is. So I want you to hear this, is I think that the evangelical beliefs, you identify yourselves as an evangelical movement, we identify ourselves, I'm part of an evangelical movement. The evangelical beliefs that we have inherited are the appropriate and the biblical understanding and expression that we have. We might differ on a few things, not many. But so out of that, I'm not looking to reinvent evangelicalism, but what I'm looking to do is to re-engage a lost world with biblical evangelicalism. And they're going to look different than the way people did it. You know, I often say of my denomination, if the 50s come back, we're ready to go. But I would be very careful not to say of your denomination, if the 80s come back, are you ready to go? It was funny when it was my denomination, wasn't it? See, so how are we engaging 2012 and 2013? The answer is going to be probably with planters that share the doctrinal beliefs that make up the Calvary Chapel, that share the passion for multiplication that's there, but that look differently than the generations that came before them. So let me close with this. I think ultimately that we're in a season of interest in church planting. Matter of fact, there's a whole conversation going on about church planting. Here's what you'll find fascinating, is we all sort of look to what you pioneered, right? I mean, I write books. In Viral Churches, I talk about you. I talk about the Calvary Chapel and what we learned from the Calvary Chapel movement along the way. But when I go to these meetings, you're absent from these meetings by and large. Sometimes one of you sneak in and sneak out before you're seen. But there's a whole conversation. Church planting is on the heart of evangelicals today. I think it's on the forefront of mission. Christianity Today wrote an article a few years ago that said that with the kind of the death, they said death or great decline, I forget the exact term, of the crusade movement. I wouldn't say that because I know one of the best known crusade evangelists is actually a Calvary Chapel guy. But with the great decline of that, I mean, it's not like it used to be. You know what they think's replaced it? Church planting. So all around us we see church planting. And I would say two things. There's much you can learn out there about systems and others, but also much you can teach. You have the organic energy, missional focus, spirit-directed passion. I would say that while you were doing that, and we're thankful, though your movement's, the percentage planting has declined, is that a lot of the rest of evangelicalism learned systems that help them to increase that. I just think, I'm just crazy enough, that if you were to combine some of the incredible things that God has gifted you with discerning systems and strategies to increase the church multiplication, Calvary Chapel will be the story that everybody's talking about. Because we already talk about you from what we all learned from you. But you're kind of absent from that conversation today. I'd like to invite you back. Maybe you're sneaking into the conferences. I'd like to invite you back. It's okay. You know, there's some people there that I don't agree with. Some I don't even like. But I can learn from them. And so my encouragement to you is this, is to ask the questions, what do we need to do strategically to build on the spirit-directed, spirit-empowered, organic multiplication we have thus far? Because I believe if we think strategically and say, well, how can we think strategically? Listen, if Moses can listen to a guy named Jethro in Exodus 18 about a better organizational structure for the people of Israel, and can follow his direction, and God is pleased because he organized and strategized well, I believe that we can listen to what the Lord is saying to the churches, apply it well into our context, take this organic, spirit-led movement, help it with systems to really increase, celebrate, and then see an exponential rate of multiplication. That's my prayer for you. And kind of as we go through, I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow, and of course Brian in the morning is going to talk as well. That's my prayer for you, and hopefully I can encourage you. Maybe even I can provoke you to love and good deeds, as Hebrews 10:24 says just a bit. Let me pray, and I'm going to turn it over to Chuck. Lord, by your grace and your goodness, you've redeemed us and called us by name. You've given us new life in Christ, and you've sent us on mission for the gospel. Father, I thank you that I stand on the shoulders as a pastor who cares about expository preaching, Spirit-led ministry, and about engaging my culture, I stand on the shoulders of this movement. But Father, I pray that you would provoke this movement to love and good deeds at a whole nother level. That they would be known for their theological passion, their doctrinal soundness, their spirit-filled ministry. But then flowing from that, they would be known as folks that are reaching people for Jesus, planting churches that give glory to his name, so that ultimately your name and your fame is more widely known among these churches and around the world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.